There is a photograph that used to hang in our hallway. It was taken the summer I turned 9 years old. In it, my father is laughing. Not smiling, laughing. The real kind, where his whole face changed and his eyes disappeared into the corners, and he looked like a man who believed, in that exact moment, that the world was a generous place. Standing next to him, one hand on my father's shoulder, is his brother. My uncle. Gerald. He is laughing too. I used to love that photograph. I used to pass it every single morning on my way to the kitchen and think, that is what our family looks like when it is happy. That is what love looks like. I was 34 years old before I understood what that photograph actually was. It was not a memory. It was evidence. And Gerald, the man standing with his hand on my father's shoulder, the man I called uncle my entire childhood, the man who sat at our Christmas table and held my baby sister and cried at my father's funeral, was the reason my father died. I know that is a heavy thing to say. I know it sounds like the kind of thing a person says when they are angry or grieving and not thinking clearly. But I am not saying it out of anger. I am not saying it out of grief. I am saying it because I spent 2 years of my life following a paper trail. That led me directly to Gerald's door. And by the time I reached the end of that trail, I had lost count of how many times he had looked me in the eyes and let me believe a lie. This is the story of how my family lost everything, and how I found out, 30 years too late, exactly who took it from us. My father's name was Robert. Everyone called him Bobby. He was the second of 3 brothers. Gerald was the eldest by 4 years. Then my father. Then the youngest, Thomas, who we called Tommy, who moved to Canada when I was 5, and who I only saw at holidays until I was old enough to understand that Tommy and Gerald did not speak. At the time, I assumed that was just what brothers sometimes did. Drifted apart. Fell out over something small that never got resolved. I never thought to ask Tommy why. I should have asked Tommy why. My father built a business from nothing. That is not me being sentimental. That is a fact. He started with a single delivery truck when he was 26 years old. His route was 3 towns, 47 clients, and a van that broke down. More times than I can count. By the time I was born, he had 12 employees. By the time I was 9, the year that photograph was taken, he had 43 employees, a depot, 2 contracts with regional supermarket chains, and a name in our town that meant something. Not famous. Not wealthy in the way that people with generational money are wealthy. But respected. Solid. The kind of business that people in our community pointed to when they wanted to give their children an example of what hard work could build. My mother used to say that my father had a gift for people. He could walk into a room where he knew no one and leave it, having made 3 friends and 1 business contact. He trusted easily. He believed in people. He thought the best of almost everyone he met. And I used to think that was his greatest quality. Now I know it was the door that Gerald walked through. Gerald was different from my father in almost every way. Where my father was warm, Gerald was polished. Where my father laughed with his whole body, Gerald smiled with just his mouth. Where my father talked about people, their lives, their families, their problems, Gerald talked about figures, numbers, returns, margins. He had worked in finance for most of his adult life. He wore suits on Sundays. He drove a car that was just slightly nicer than anything my father owned. And he had a way of mentioning that car, or his apartment, or his holidays. That never sounded like bragging, but always left you aware of the difference between what he had and what you had. I was a child, so I did not understand any of this at the time. To me, Gerald was simply Uncle Gerald. He came for Christmas and Easter and occasionally for birthday dinners. He brought good wine. He ruffled my hair. He once took me to a football match and bought me a program and a hot chocolate, and I thought he was the best person in the world. He had a way of making you feel that way. That was the thing I did not understand until much later. Gerald never made you feel good by accident. He made you feel good because he needed something. My father brought Gerald into the business in the year I turned 11. I remember the dinner where he announced it. My mother had made a roast. Gerald had brought a bottle of something expensive. My father stood up at the head of the table. He never stood up during dinner. That was the first sign I registered, even as a child, that this was a serious moment, and he said, "I've asked Gerald to come on board, to help with the financial side. The business has grown to a point where I need someone I trust, keeping an eye on the numbers." My mother smiled. My sister and I didn't fully understand what it meant. Gerald raised his glass. He said, and I remember this clearly, "I'm honored, Bobby. I'll do right by you. I'll do right by you." I remember thinking that was an odd thing to say. Not thank you, or I'm excited. I'll do right by you. Like a promise made to someone who had asked for something they shouldn't have had to ask for. Like something that needed to be sworn. I was 11 years old. I let it go. I wish I hadn't. The first 2 years after Gerald joined the business were, on the surface, completely normal. The business continued to grow. My father seemed happy. He and Gerald spoke on the phone several times a week. Gerald started coming around more often, not just for holidays, but for Sunday lunches, for impromptu dinners, for conversations. At our kitchen table that ran late into the evening, my mother always fed him. She treated him like a second husband, in the way that you treat someone who is woven into your daily life, whether you planned it or not. She said once to a friend within earshot of me, "Bobby loves having Gerald here. It's good for him having his brother close. They've never been like this before." And she was right. Before the business, Gerald visited a few times a year. After, he was practically part of the household. I used to think he loved us. I used to think that was why he was always there. But here is what I remember, even from those early years, that I never had a name for until I was an adult. Whenever my father seemed particularly happy, a new contract signed, a problem solved, a good week, Gerald would ask a question. Not a congratulatory question. A destabilizing one. "Have you thought about what happens if that chain pulls the contract? You'd be exposed, pretty significantly exposed, Bobby." Or, "That new route looks good, but you're stretching your cash reserves thin. What's your buffer if a truck goes down?" Or, "I ran the projections last night. The growth looks great on the surface, but the margin compression is something we need to talk about." Always something. Always a shadow drawn over a moment of light. I was 12, 13, 14 years old. I couldn't have told you why those moments made me uncomfortable. I only knew that my father would walk into dinner looking like the man. In that photograph, eyes lit up, whole body open, and by the time Gerald left, something in him had settled. Dimmed. Like a lamp turned slightly lower. I told myself it was just business. That adults had pressures I didn't understand. And for years, that was enough of an explanation. It wasn't enough. Not even close. There is one more thing I need to tell you about before the real story begins. When I was 15, my father's youngest brother, Tommy, in Canada, called the house. I answered the phone. Tommy asked to speak to my father. I went to get him, and as I walked to the kitchen, I passed the door to my father's study, which was slightly open. I could hear Gerald's voice inside. I stopped. I don't know why. Call it instinct. Call it something in the tone that felt wrong before I could explain why. Gerald was saying, in a low, controlled voice. If you talk to Tommy, you need to be careful about what you tell him. He doesn't understand the business. He'll panic over nothing and make things complicated for both of us. There was a pause. Then my father's voice. He's my brother, Gerald. And Gerald. So am I. I didn't tell my father I'd heard. I handed him the phone and walked away. But I have turned those 6 words over in my mind. More times than I can count in the years since. So am I. What did that mean? What was Gerald afraid my father would tell Tommy? What was he afraid Tommy already knew? I didn't find out for another 19 years. And by then, my father had been dead for 16 of them. My father got sick when I was 17. Not suddenly. The way sickness comes to people who have been quietly carrying. Too much for too long, gradually, and then all at once. He started losing weight. He stopped sleeping. He would leave for the depot before sunrise and come home after dark. And sit at the dinner table without eating and tell my mother everything. Was fine, the business was fine, he was just tired. My mother believed him. Or she chose to believe him. I think sometimes love makes that choice for us. I didn't believe him. I watched my father, the man who had laughed with his whole body, who had trusted everyone, who had built something from nothing. I watched him become someone quieter, someone smaller, someone who flinched when the phone rang. By the time the doctors gave the diagnosis, it had a name. Stress-induced cardiac deterioration. A damaged heart, partly genetic, partly environmental. The cardiologist said to my mother, the physical component was always there, but without sustained, high-level stress, it may never have become what it became. Sustained high-level stress. I am going to come back to that phrase, because it matters more than I understood at the time. My father died 3 months after his 51st birthday. I was 18 years old. My sister was 15. My mother was 47 and had never worked outside the home. Because my father had always said, and he meant it genuinely, your job is our family, that is more than enough. Which was beautiful. And which left her, at 47 years old, with 2 daughters, a house with a mortgage, and a business she didn't know how to run. The week before my father died, Gerald came to the hospital. He sat in the room for an hour. He held my father's hand. He cried. Real tears. Or what looked like real tears. I was sitting in the corner, and I watched him cry, and I thought, whatever else Gerald is, he loves my father. People can love someone and still destroy them. I know that now. I didn't know it then. At the funeral, Gerald was a pillar. That is the only word for it. He organized things. He made calls. He spoke to the funeral home, to the solicitor, to the suppliers who came to pay their respects. He gave a eulogy that made half the room cry. He talked about my father's laugh. He talked about the delivery truck. He talked about what it meant to build something real. People came up to my mother afterward and said, "You're so lucky to have Gerald. He's going to look after you all." My mother believed them. I remember standing at the edge of the reception, watching Gerald work the room with his quiet competence, his dark suit, his controlled grief, and feeling something I couldn't name. Not gratitude. Something else. Something cold. In the months after my father died, Gerald took over the business. Officially, my mother was the owner. It was in my father's will. The business, the depot, the contracts, the vehicles all passed to her. But my mother had never read a balance sheet. She had never negotiated a supplier contract. She had never sat across a table from a bank manager and made a case. For a line of credit, Gerald offered to manage everything. "Just until things stabilize," he said. "Just until you're ready." My mother thanked him with tears in her eyes. She gave him signing rights. She gave him access to the accounts. She gave him everything my father had built, placed it in his hands, and trusted him the way my father had. The way our family had always trusted him. And Gerald took it. He took all of it. Just not in the way we could see. I went to university the following year. I am not proud of what I am about to tell you. I was grieving. I was 18. I had a scholarship and a campus 300 miles away. And the relief, the shameful private relief of distance. From a house that no longer felt like home. So I went. I called my mother every week. I came home for holidays. I told myself the business was in good hands because Gerald said it was. I told myself my mother was managing because she said she was. And the years passed. The way years do when you are young and building your own life. And grief becomes something you carry rather than something you sit inside of. I graduated. I got a job in a city 2 hours from home. I got an apartment. I got on with it. And the whole time, Gerald was back there. At the business. With the accounts. With the signing rights. Getting on with it too. Just not in the way any of us knew. It was my mother who first said something, 7 years after my father died. I was 25. I had come home for Christmas. She sat me down at the kitchen table, not at dinner, not casually, but deliberately, with the air of someone who had been rehearsing this conversation and was not sure how to start. She said, "Something feels off, love, with the business, with the money." I asked her what she meant. She said she wasn't sure. She said she had started looking at the statements Gerald sent her. She had never really read them before, just signed where he told her to sign, and some of the numbers didn't make sense to her. She said the business had been profitable when your father ran it. And the contracts were still there, and Gerald had taken on new ones. So why was there never any money? Why was there never a dividend? Why was the depot listed as collateral on a loan she didn't remember signing for? I remember the cold that moved through me when she said that. I took the statements from her. I spread them across the kitchen table. I was not an accountant. I had no training in finance. But I had 2 working eyes and a functioning brain. And even I could see that the numbers were wrong. I confronted Gerald the following week. I called him and asked to meet. We sat in a cafe. He was calm. He was always calm. He explained that the business had faced headwinds. Rising fuel costs. Supplier price increases. 2 large clients who had moved to competitors. He explained that the loan was necessary to refinance short-term debt. That would have otherwise triggered default. He explained all of it in the same smooth, measured voice. He had used my entire life. And I almost believed him. Almost. Because there was a moment, just a moment, when I asked him about a specific transfer on the statement. A large round number transfer to an account I didn't recognize. And for 1/2 second before he answered, Gerald blinked. Just once. Too slow. A single tell in 17 years of composure. He said it was a supplier payment. He said he'd send me the documentation. He never sent the documentation. And when I called to follow up, he said it must have gone to my junk folder and he'd resend it. He never resent it. I want to pause here, not on the surface of what I'm describing, but on what it felt like. Because I think you need to understand what it is like to suspect someone you have loved your entire life. Someone who cried at your father's funeral. Someone who ruffled your hair and took you to football matches. And said, "I'll do right by you" at a Sunday dinner. 23 years before. It is not like suspecting a stranger. It does not feel clean. It feels like the ground beneath you is uncertain. Every memory becomes a question. Every kindness becomes a calculation. Was any of it real? Was any of it genuine? Or was all of it Every smile, every holiday, every Sunday dinner. Was all of it just the maintenance work of a man who needed to be trusted so that he could take? I didn't know yet, but I was going to find out. I need to tell you about the call that changed everything. The call I almost didn't make. 8 months after my conversation with Gerald in the cafe. 8 months of dead ends and stonewalling and statements. That didn't quite add up no matter how many times I looked. I found my Uncle Tommy's phone number. He was still in Canada. We hadn't spoken in years. I almost didn't call. I told myself he was too far removed from the business to know anything. I told myself it would be awkward. I told myself it might be nothing. But late on a Thursday night, sitting at my kitchen table, with a glass of wine and a folder full of statements, and that one blinking memory of Gerald saying, "So am I." I called. Tommy answered on the third ring. He said hello. I said, "Tommy, it's me, Bobby's daughter." There was a silence. And then Tommy said, "I wondered when you'd call. I want to let that land. I wondered when you'd call. Not how lovely to hear from you. Not what a surprise. I wondered when you'd call." Like he had been waiting. Like he had known this day was coming for a very long time. Tommy talked for 3 hours. I know because when I finally looked up from the notes I was scribbling, my phone had 19% battery, and the sky outside my window was turning gray. What he told me was not a single revelation. It was a sequence, a slow unfolding, like pulling a thread and watching a sweater come apart, and realizing as it unravels that the sweater was never what you thought it was. Let me tell you what Tommy told me. And then let me tell you what I confirmed on my own. And then let me tell you what all of it meant. Tommy said that he and Gerald had barely spoken for 30 years. He said the falling out happened before I was born, when the 3 brothers were still young men, and that it had to do with their parents' estate. Their mother and father had died within 2 years of each other. There was a small inheritance. Not life-changing money, but meaningful, a house that was sold. Some savings, a plot of land. Tommy said Gerald had handled the estate. He was the eldest. It made sense at the time for him to take charge. By the time Tommy had seen the accounting, 3 months after the estate was settled, Gerald's share was almost 3 times what it should have been. Tommy confronted him. Gerald denied it. Gerald said Tommy was misreading the documents. Gerald said the costs had been higher than anticipated. And then Gerald did something Tommy never forgave him for. Gerald went to my father, Bobby, and told him Tommy was making accusations out of jealousy. That Tommy had always resented Gerald. That Tommy was unstable. My father believed Gerald. He chose his eldest brother. Tommy left for Canada within the year. He said to me on the phone, "Bobby was the best man I knew. He was just blind to Gerald." Because Bobby couldn't imagine doing what Gerald did. So he couldn't see it when someone he loved was doing it. I wrote that down. I underlined it 3 times. Bobby was just blind to Gerald because he couldn't imagine doing what Gerald did. That was the door. That was how Gerald walked in and never left. Tommy said he had tried, over the years, to warn my father. He had made 2 trips back from Canada. He had written letters. He had made phone calls. He said my father always listened. And then my father always called Gerald. And then my father would call Tommy back and say that Gerald had explained everything and there was nothing to worry about. And that Tommy really needed to let the past go. Tommy stopped trying when I was about 12 years old. The year Gerald joined the business. He said he found out about that, Gerald coming on board. From a mutual acquaintance, not from my father. He said that was the moment he knew. He said he sat in his kitchen in Canada, and he thought, Bobby has just handed Gerald the keys. And he knew, with a certainty he couldn't explain but never doubted. That my father would not be okay. He just hadn't known how bad it would get. I need to tell you what Gerald actually did. Not the version he gave my mother in soothing tones. Over cups of tea in our kitchen. Not the version he gave me in the cafe, calm and plausible. And just credible enough. The real version. The one that took me 2 years to reconstruct. With the help of a forensic accountant named Patricia, who charged me money I didn't have, and who said to me, the first time she looked at the documents, whoever set this up knew exactly what they were doing. Here is what Gerald did. When he came on board the business, when my father stood up at that Sunday dinner and said he was bringing in someone he trusted to look after the numbers, Gerald did not steal immediately. He waited. 13 months. 13 months of doing his job correctly. 13 months of clean books, accurate reports, legitimate transfers. 13 months of being exactly what my father needed him to be. Because Gerald was patient. Gerald understood something most people don't. That the best time to begin taking from someone is after you have thoroughly convinced them there is nothing to take. After 13 months, Gerald began redirecting small amounts. Not from the main accounts. From sub-accounts. From petty cash structures he had set up and my father had signed off on. Without reading the details. From supplier payment accounts where a slight discrepancy would look like an invoice processing delay. Not a theft. He did this for 8 months. Small amounts. Testing. Watching. My father never noticed. Of course he didn't. He trusted Gerald completely. And Gerald had spent 13 months making sure that trust was solid. Then Gerald got bigger. He set up a shell company. I don't want to get lost in the financial mechanics, but you need to understand the basic shape of it. Gerald created a company, a logistics consultancy, registered under a name that did not belong to him directly. He registered it through a holding structure in a different county. He then began billing my father's business from that shell company. Consultancy fees, route optimization services, fleet management advisory. None of it existed. None of it was real. But the invoices were professional. They were formatted correctly. They referenced real operational concerns. And Gerald approved them for payment because Gerald was the one approving all payments, and the money flowed from my father's business into that shell company. Month after month. For 6 years. He billed my father's business over £800,000 for services that were never rendered. I will say that again. £800,000. Over 6 years. Through a company my father never knew existed. Billed by a man my father called his brother. Approved by that same man. Paid without question. Because there was no one to question them. Because my father trusted Gerald. And because my father was sick, quietly, steadily, increasingly sick. With the stress of a business that was bleeding money. He couldn't account for. Patricia, the forensic accountant, showed me a projection. She modeled what the business would have looked like. Without the fraudulent billing. Without the shell company withdrawals. Without the side accounts and the petty cash diversions. And the loan Gerald had arranged, which, Patricia explained, appeared to have been arranged with a lender who had a fee-sharing arrangement that redirected a portion of the loan establishment costs back to a separate account in Gerald's name. Without all of it, the business would have been worth, conservatively, £2 to £3 million at the point of my father's death. My mother would have inherited a solvent, profitable business with a clean balance sheet and contracts in place. She would never have needed to work again. She could have sold it. She could have passed it on. She could have lived the rest of her life in security. Instead, at 47 years old, she inherited a business That looked profitable on paper and was hemorrhaging money in reality. And Gerald was the only person who knew why. I want to tell you how this made me feel, but I don't have words for it. I had words for things before this. I was a person who had words. When Patricia sat across from me and walked me through the timeline and the figures and the structure of what Gerald had done, I sat there and I could not speak. Not because I was crying, because the thing she was describing was so large and had been happening for so long, and I had been so completely unaware of it. I kept trying to absorb it, and it kept being too big. My father had not just been robbed. He had been robbed by the person he trusted most, over a period of 6 years, in a way designed so carefully that my father could never have found it without professional help. And in the process of being robbed, my father had carried the stress of a business that was underperforming in ways he could not explain. He had lain awake. He had skipped meals. He had flinched when the phone rang. He had stood at that Christmas dinner, thinner than the year before, and told my mother everything was fine. He had died at 51, and Gerald had stood at his graveside and cried, and then gone back to the office on Monday morning, and continued. There is a thing that happens when you discover a truth this large, a kind of inversion. Every memory you have of the person in question folds backwards. I thought of Gerald ruffling my hair. I thought of him at the football match with the program and the hot chocolate. I thought of the bottle of wine he always brought. I thought of the way he had cried, holding my father's hand in the hospital. And I thought, was he crying for my father? Or was he crying because my father was dying before Gerald was finished with him, before the business was fully drained, before Gerald had extracted everything he could? I thought of the eulogy, the beautiful eulogy, my father's laugh, the delivery truck, what it meant to build something real. A eulogy delivered by the man who had spent 6 years making sure that something real could not survive. What was that? What do you call that? What do you call a man who can stand at a grave, he helped it, and speak beautifully about the person inside it? I don't have a word for it. I looked for one. I never found one. But here is what I want you to understand. And this is the thing I couldn't stop thinking about for months. Gerald had not finished when my father died. My father's death was not the end of what Gerald took. It was the middle. Because after my father died, my mother gave Gerald even more access than before. And Gerald kept going. He kept the shell company active for another 6 years. After my father's funeral, he kept billing. He kept approving. He kept transferring. Not as aggressively, but steadily. The way a fire burns lower but keeps burning, if no one finds it. By the time I sat across from Patricia with those statements, Gerald had taken, in total, across the entire period, from my father and then from my mother, who never knew, who thanked him for looking after her, who told her friends she was lucky to have him. £1.2 million. £1.2 million. From a family he sat with at Christmas. From a man who called him brother. From a woman who fed him on Sundays. From children who called him uncle. From a dead man who could not defend himself. £1.2 million. And Gerald was still there. Still coming for dinner. Still sending my mother statements she didn't fully read. Still being Gerald. I need to tell you about the months between finding out and deciding what to do. Because that gap, that horrible, suspended, sleepless gap, is part of the story. I knew what Gerald had done. Patricia had documented it. 18 months of forensic work, original bank records. I had managed to obtain through my mother's account access. Shell company registration, documents retrieved from company's house. Cross-referenced billing dates, invoice numbers that didn't match, any real supplier on record. It was all there. The paper trail was real. It was damning. And it was not going to disappear. So the question was not whether Gerald had done this. The question was what I was going to do about it. And that was harder than I expected. Not because I wasn't angry. I was angry in a way I didn't know was possible. A quiet, constant, bone-deep fury that I carried every morning. When I woke up, and every night when I couldn't sleep. But I was dealing with something bigger than anger. I was dealing with the fact that this would destroy my mother. Not figuratively. Literally. The person who had told her friends she was lucky to have Gerald. The person who had thanked him, publicly and privately, for the past 16 years. The person who had handed him the business her husband built and trusted him to keep it safe. She was going to find out that she had spent those 16 years being robbed by a man she believed loved her family. That her husband's stress, the stress that damaged his heart, was engineered by his own brother. She was going to find out all of this at once. And she was 63 years old. And she had already lost so much. I spent 3 weeks deciding how to tell her. I went back and forth. I wrote scripts for the conversation. I threw them away. I called my sister. She lived abroad by then, her own life. Her own distance, and I told her everything I knew. The silence on the other end of the line was the longest of my life. Then my sister said, "We have to tell Mum, we don't have a choice." She was right. We didn't have a choice. We had never had a choice. The only question was how. I went home on a Saturday. My sister flew in on the Friday night. We told my mother on Saturday morning, sitting at the same kitchen table, where Gerald had been fed Sunday dinners for 25 years. I put the documents in front of her. I walked her through it slowly. I told her what Patricia had found. I told her about the shell company. I told her about the billing structure. I told her about the total. £1.2 million. Taken over 14 years. From her husband. And then from her. My mother did not cry immediately. She sat very still. She looked at the documents on the table. She looked at me. She looked at my sister. And then she said something I will never forget for the rest of my life. She said, "I used to wonder why there was never anything left at the end of the year. Your father used to wonder too. He thought he was doing something wrong. He thought it was him. He thought it was him. My father died, believing the business he had built was failing. Because of something he had done or not done. He died with that. He died carrying the weight of a problem Gerald created. And Gerald benefited from. And Gerald let my father carry to his grave." My mother put her hands flat on the table. She pressed her palms down. She took a very long, steady breath. And then she said, "What do we do now?" We went to the police first. Economic Crime Unit. We presented Patricia's report. We presented the documentation. The detective who took the initial report was a woman who had been in fraud investigation for 15 years. She read through the summary without expression. When she looked up, she said, "This is thorough. Whoever prepared this did good work." She said they would need time to review. She said economic crime cases were complex. She said she couldn't make any promises about timeline. She said all of the things you expect to be told in the small, carpeted office of a police station. But she also said one thing I didn't expect. She said, "Has he been told yet, the subject?" I said no. She nodded. She said, "Keep it that way, for now." I kept it that way. For 6 more weeks. And then I couldn't anymore. The confrontation happened at Gerald's house. I called him and said I needed to talk. He said, of course, what was it about? I said I'd rather do it in person. He said he'd put the kettle on. I drove to his house. I sat in his kitchen. He made tea with the ease of a man who had not spent the last 14 years committing fraud against his dead brother's family. He sat across from me. He asked how my mother was. He asked how my sister was. He was wearing a cardigan. He looked like someone's grandfather. He looked like the man in the photograph. And I sat there with the folder on my lap. And I looked at him. And I thought, he has no idea. He has absolutely no idea that I know. Because Gerald had lived for 14 years inside a version of the truth where no one was looking, where my mother didn't read the statements, where I lived 2 hours away, where Tommy was in Canada and long since dismissed, where my father was gone. Gerald had never had to be afraid of us. He had never needed to be. Until now. I put the folder on the table. I said, I've had a forensic accountant review the business accounts. Going back to the year you joined, all of them including the ones tied to the consultancy company you registered in 2003. The name I used for the shell company was its actual name. I said it clearly. I watched Gerald's face. And here is what I want to tell you about that moment. Because I think you are expecting something dramatic. You are expecting him to go pale, to stand up, to shout, to break. He didn't. Gerald looked at the folder. He looked at me. He picked up his cup of tea. He took a sip. And then he said, I think you may have misunderstood some of what you're looking at. I stared at him. The consultancy billed legitimate services. I can produce the documentation if there's any confusion. Confusion. He used the word confusion. I said, Patricia has cross-referenced every invoice against supplier records, bank statements, and the company registration history. There is no documentation because the services didn't exist. He nodded slowly. He said, Who is Patricia? I told him. He nodded again. He set down his cup. He said, I'd like to speak to my solicitor before this conversation continues. And that was it. No confession. No apology. No crack in the composure. Just, I'd like to speak to my solicitor. I left his house. I sat in my car outside. My hands were shaking. Not from fear. From the strangeness of it. From confronting a monster and finding a man in a cardigan who asked to call his lawyer. 3 days after that meeting, Gerald called my mother. I found out about this afterward. He called her, not me, her, and told her that I had come to him with some concerns about the business accounts. He told her that he had spoken to his solicitor. He told her that there had been some accounting decisions over the years that were perhaps not communicated as clearly as they should have been, but that his intention had always been to protect the business, to protect the family. He told my mother he hoped this could be resolved within the family. He said he was hurt that it had reached this point. He said he hoped she knew how much she and her daughters meant to him, how much Bobby had meant to him. My mother called me immediately after. She was shaking. I could hear it. She said, He sounded so sincere. I know. I know he did. He always sounds sincere. That is the whole point. I told my mother, do not call him back. Do not meet with him. Do not have any further contact. The police have the file. Let them do their work. She said, It's Gerald. I said, I know, Mom, I know. And I didn't know what else to say. Because it was Gerald. It was the man in the photograph. It was the man who brought good wine and ruffled my hair and gave a beautiful eulogy and cried holding my father's hand. It was still all of that. And it was also what it was. Both things at once. Real and monstrous. Genuine and criminal. That is the thing, no one tells you about betrayal at this scale. It is not clean. It does not resolve into a simple story about a villain. It stays complicated. It stays painful. Even when you know every fact. Even when the evidence is overwhelming. Even when justice is coming. It stays human. And that is, in some ways, the hardest part of all. The investigation took 14 months. I want to be honest about that. 14 months is a long time to live inside a story like this. 14 months of phone calls from the detective. Of documents requested and sent. Of delays explained and unexplained. Of Gerald's solicitor submitting responses and challenges. And procedural objections. Of going about my ordinary life, going to work, buying groceries. Calling my mother on Sundays, while underneath everything. This enormous grinding legal machine was deciding what happened next. I won't pretend those 14 months were fine. They weren't. There were weeks where I thought nothing would come of it, where I thought Gerald would find a way out, where I thought his solicitor would construct some version of events, where every fraudulent invoice was a legitimate misunderstanding, and every unexplained transfer was a reasonable accounting decision. And we would walk away with nothing. Patricia told me to trust the documentation. She said, "Fraud cases live and die on paper trails. You have one of the most complete paper trails I have ever seen. In a case of this nature." I held on to that. Some days it was the only thing I had. The criminal charges were filed 18 months after I first called Tommy. Gerald was charged with fraud by false representation, fraudulent trading, and money laundering. The total amount specified in the charges was £1.4 million. The additional $200,000 above Patricia's initial estimate came from accounts Patricia had not yet accessed at the time of our first conversation. Gerald was arrested at his home early on a Tuesday morning. I was not there. I was at work. My mother called me. She said, "It's happened." I said, "I know." She said, "I don't know how I feel." I said, "That's okay." And it was. There is no rule that says you have to feel a particular way. When a person you once loved is being handcuffed in his kitchen, there is no correct emotion for that moment. You just feel whatever you feel. And you hold it. And you keep going. The trial was 7 days. Gerald pleaded not guilty. Of course he did. His defense was that the services billed by the consultancy company were genuine, that the documentation had been lost or misfiled, that the accounting decisions were made in good faith, under pressure of the business conditions at the time. His barrister was very good. Patricia was better. She spent 2 days on the stand. She walked the jury through the paper trail with the calm and clarity of someone who has spent a career translating complexity into truth. She showed them the billing dates. She showed them the shell company registration. She showed them the fee-sharing arrangement on the loan. She showed them the projections, what the business would have been worse without the fraud. She showed them the stress assessments in my father's medical records, obtained with my mother's consent, that described a man being destroyed by pressures he could not account for. She showed them everything. And she showed it quietly, without drama, without theater, just the facts in order until the picture was so clear that there was nothing left to dispute. The jury took 2 days to deliberate. They found Gerald guilty on all counts. I was in the courtroom. My mother was beside me. My sister had flown back. Tommy, from Canada, who had tried to warn us 30 years ago and been dismissed and exiled for it, Tommy was in the row behind us. He had flown over for the verdict. I hadn't asked him to. He came anyway. When the verdict was read, the courtroom was very quiet. My mother gripped my hand. I gripped back. I didn't look at Gerald. I couldn't. I was looking at my mother's face. And what I saw there was not triumph. It was not relief. It was something more complicated. Something that looked like grief finally finding its right shape. Like a question she had carried for 30 years. Finally getting its answer. Not the answer she wanted. Not the answer any of us would have chosen. But the truth. The actual truth. And there is something in that. Even when it hurts. There is something in finally knowing. Gerald was sentenced to 7 years in prison. He was ordered to pay reparations. The amount recovered, through asset seizure and the proceeds of the sale of his property, was just under £600,000. That is less than half of what he took. The rest is gone. Spent. Moved through structures that were difficult to trace. By the time the investigation reached them, some of it we will never recover. I want to be honest about that. This is not a story where everything is returned and the balance is settled. And the books close with a satisfying click. Life is not an audit. You cannot always make the numbers right. My mother received her portion of the reparations. It was meaningful. It was not what she should have had. It is not what my father built for her. It is not the £2 to £3 million the business would have been worth. If Gerald had never put his hand on my father's shoulder and said, "I'll do right by you," it is a fraction. And we have to live with that. We do live with it. After the sentencing, I stood outside the court with Tommy. He looked older than I remembered. Smaller, somehow, though that might have been the coat he was wearing. He said, "Your father would have hated all of this." I said, "I know." He said, "Not the trial, not the verdict, just the fact of it. That it was Gerald. He would have hated that it was Gerald." I didn't say anything. Tommy looked at the ground. He said, "I tried to tell him. I tried more than once." I said, "I know." He said, "He didn't believe me, but that wasn't his fault. He just couldn't see it. It wasn't a flaw, it was a gift. That Gerald used against him." I thought about that. I still think about it. My father's ability to trust was not a weakness. It was something good in him. Something real. Gerald corrupted it. Turned it into a tool. The goodness was my father's. The corruption was Gerald's. I need to keep those two things separate. I need to keep them from merging into the same thing. Because if I let them merge, if I let what Gerald did make my father's trust look like a mistake, then Gerald wins something he doesn't deserve. He takes something else. Something that doesn't appear on any financial statement, but matters more than any of them. There is still the photograph. The one in the hallway. My father laughing. Gerald with his hand on my father's shoulder. The summer I was 9. I took it down after the trial. My mother said she understood. I held it for a long time before I decided what to do with it. I thought about destroying it. I thought about hiding it. In the end, I put it in a box. Not because I want to pretend it doesn't exist. Not because I can't look at my father's face. But because I don't want Gerald in my hallway anymore. I don't want him that close to the ordinary rhythm of my mornings. He's taken enough. He doesn't get that too. I think about my father most at unexpected times. Not at Christmas or on his birthday. Those are the times you brace for. I think about him when I see a delivery truck. When I hear someone laugh the real way, the way where their whole face changes and their eyes disappear. When I walk into a room and notice someone working it the way Gerald did. A smile with just the mouth, a question shaped like care. I notice it now. I notice it in a way I could not before. I don't know if that is something I gained or something I lost. Maybe both. My mother is 70 now. She is well. She sold what remained of the business 8 years ago. What was left of it after Gerald, which wasn't much. And she lives in a small house in the town where she raised us. And she has a garden, and she has her friends, and she has her daughters, and she has her life. It is a smaller life than it should have been. But it is hers. And Gerald did not take everything. He took money. He took the business. He took years of security that my father worked himself half to death to build. He took my father's peace of mind. He may have shortened my father's life. But he did not take our family. He did not take what we have with each other. He did not take the memory of my father laughing. He did not take the truth of who my father was. None of that fits in a shell company. None of that can be billed to an account. I want to say one more thing before I close. For everyone listening who has a Gerald in their life, someone trusted with something real, someone who smiles with just the mouth, someone who answers a direct question with a smooth explanation, and promises documentation they never send. You are allowed to look closer. You are allowed to ask the question that feels uncomfortable. You are allowed to call the Tommy in your life, the one who is pushed out, written off, labeled as unstable, and listen to what they actually have to say. You do not have to wait 30 years. You do not have to wait until a funeral. You are allowed to trust your instincts, even about the people you love, especially about the people you love, because sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one who has made themselves irreplaceable, the one everyone says you're so lucky to have, the one who brings good wine and gives beautiful eulogies and keeps his hand on your shoulder in photographs, the one who says, when given everything, I'll do right by you. If this story moved you in any way, if it made you think of someone, something, a moment you've been trying not to look at too closely, I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. And if you feel like this channel is worth staying with, you know where the button is. This is Shattered Loyalties, and I'll be here with the next story whenever you're ready.